Okay, good morning and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is Jane Wayellen Armstrong. I am the MLA for Moultrie-Klitchou Region and Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask members in the room to introduce themselves for the record.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Center, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Here's Esther, the member for Range Lake. Thank you for coming today.
Cheryl Yakalad, member for the Techo. Welcome.
George Nirzu, MLA for the Mackenzie Delta. Welcome.
I'm Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North. So glad you could make it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm MLA Kate Reed for the District of Great Slave. I'm so happy you could join us today. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Today we are joined by Professor Carl Widerquist of Georgetown University, Qatar, to receive a presentation on basic income. Please note this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly social media channel. I would like to remind all members and our witness to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. I will now pass it over to Mr. Widerquist.
Thank you. My name is Carl Widerquist. I'm from Cassopolis, Michigan. I am originally from Cassopolis, Michigan. I now make my home in New Orleans and work in Qatar, where I'm a professor of philosophy. I also have a background in economics, and I've published in both disciplines as well as anthropology. I have been studying basic income since the 20th century, and my latest book is a primer on universal basic income called Universal Basic Income Essential Knowledge, which is out on MIT Press. I'm here to talk about this as a very realistic policy option for us. Now, a little more than 100 years ago, Bertrand Russell described basic income to this effect, that a certain small income should be secured for all, whether or not they work. And then a larger income should be secured for those who engage in work that the community recognizes as useful. On this basis, we shall build further. So basic income is not the end of social justice. It's not all there is to social justice, but it's an important base. It's an important base because it smooths out it smooths out the fear and the cruelties of the market economy as we know it, where we know that if you're not eligible for any particular government program, and you're not eligible for, you don't have a job for whatever reason, and you're not eligible for government programs, that you risk homelessness, poverty, economic destitution. And except for the independently wealthy, this anxiety and this fear, and this very realistic fear, hangs over all of our heads, and it doesn't have to. If we have a universal safety net rather than a conditional safety net as we have now. That's the very idea of it. Now, let me move towards this idea by starting with something that I think is maybe a little more familiar and will make some of the reasoning behind it a little bit clearer. Consider the pollution tax, especially pollution related to climate change, the carbon tax. Now, we know that one of the best ways to discourage environmental degradation is to tax activities that harm the environment, such as the release of greenhouse gases, but also the release of all kinds of other pollution. All kinds of other pollutions. You tax them, you discourage the use of them, and you therefore encourage resources to go into things that are less environmentally damaging. However, people will argue, and they're very fair to argue, that taxes, all taxes are to some extent discouraging of economic activity. And if all you do is raise taxes, you are discouraging economic activity. And that could be harmful to the macroeconomy, and that's often been used as a reason to oppose these sorts of taxes. Now, but one of the proposals, the tax and dividend proposal for global warming, but also for pollution in general, is to tax things that pollute, and then take that, instead of just putting that money into the general revenue, you take that exact amount of money and you redistribute that in a form of a grant to everyone, equal dividend for every person in the jurisdiction, whether that's Canada or whether that's the Northwest Territories. Now, if you do that, what you're then doing is you're not discouraging economic activity at all, because you are making all the economic activities that are polluting more expensive. And you're making all the other economic activities, the ones that pollute less, you are making those cheaper. But you are not taking any money out of the macroeconomy at all. There's an equal amount of stimulation to the macroeconomy. It is just being redirected from the things we don't want people to do to the things that we do want people to do. And it's also redistributive at the same time. The people who are the wealthiest, the people who own, control, use, or use up our resources are also the ones that will pay the most taxes. And those who own or use up the least amount of our resources are the ones that are going to receive more in the dividend than they pay in these taxes. And so it's redistributive. It helps people at the bottom because it is unconditional what we give out. But it has something that it has an element to it when you look at it in this sort of a context, that it has something in it that rebuts one of the arguments against a universal dividend. And that's, people will say it is something for nothing. It is certainly not something for nothing. The current system is a lot closer to something for nothing than this sort of system is. Because if under this tax and dividend system, if you are paying more than you're receiving, you're paying more in these pollution taxes than you're receiving in your pollution dividend, that is your penalty or your fee, depending on how you want to look at it. That's your penalty or your fee for being an above average polluter. You certainly, if you are helping to use up the resources of this planet and make it less livable for everybody else, you certainly ought to be paying more than other people. Whereas if you're receiving more in a dividend than you're paying in these pollution taxes, that is your reward for being a below average polluter. You are doing less environmental harm to the average person, and we're rewarding you for that. So it is a reward that you're well deserved. You're also being compensated for the fact that other people are harming the environment. And you're being compensated in a way that discourages their continued harm of the environment. Now, if you start from there, you can extend that to other resources that aren't necessarily polluting, but are, when people dominate, the ownership of our mines, our oil fields, our land, our real estate, our banking system, even though the banking system is created by the federal government and the risk is taken out of it by the federal government. All of things like these are also owned and controlled and used primarily by a small group of people who have never paid compensation, the fact that they control the resources. So you could extend this really to a tax on wealth, or a tax on resource ownership, rental value of land and mines and things like that. And then if you're paying more in these taxes, that is your fee for controlling more of the Earth's resources than the average person. Nature did not give the resources of the Northwest Territories or of Canada in general, or the world in general, to a few elite corporations. Governments did that. But governments have never asked, governments set the rules that put in place where people have more. But governments have never really said, you as the elite, those who won't, have a responsibility to pay back through those who have less access to resources, because you do. So you can look at, so a basic income, as I look at it, is your, if you're getting more in your basic income than you're paying in these sorts of taxes, that is your reward for putting less of a demand on the Earth's resources than the average person, and that's a well-deserved reward. You're getting goods and services from the other people who are using more of the Earth's resources. So it is really, if you look at it in this way, there's really no question about whether the dessert is not something for nothing. It is your compensation for rules that have been made that create privileges for some, disadvantages for others. And if we put this sort of a policy in place, it doesn't fix all of our other problems, but it helps with a lot of our other problems. Studies that have been done where things like this have been put into place have found that the educational performance of children gets better. Children not only perform better in school, they stay in school longer. And this is something that in direct interventions is very hard to achieve. You say if you've got a disadvantaged neighborhood in the schools, and you've got underachieving students in the schools. What can we do to the school to help these students do better? And it's very hard to help the students do better by intervening only at the school. But it turns out if the parents are less poor and the children are under less stress, less housing insecurity, less hunger, less food insecurity, they do better. And in a whole neighborhood of students where all of the students have less to fear in this, students tend to do better. You also get better health across the board. Many of our diseases, many of our worst diseases, are complications of poverty and destitution, including things that you don't often expect. Things such as spousal abuse tend to go down. Mental health gets better. Even people checking themselves or being checked into hospitals for a mental break has gone down when they are less in poverty. The issue of spousal abuse happens for two reasons. One is a lot of spousal abuse is misdirected anger by people who are angry because they're getting an unfair deal and they don't know where and why and how that's coming from. But they feel disadvantaged and powerless in their life, and they do violence to people who they do have power over. It reduces that stress. It works on that end, but it also works on the other end, because if you look at who tends to be the victim of spousal abuse, it tends to be people who are financially dependent on their partners. If you reduce that financial dependence by making people, especially women and caretakers of children, make them less dependent on their spouse, you make them less vulnerable to domestic violence. It also gives an incentive for employers to pay better wages and give better working conditions. Now, some of the common criticisms are, a lot of them are very often misdirected. One of the common criticisms, especially in an area like the Northwest Territories, that people will say, well, if you give this, people will just spend it on drugs. It's interesting that people said, because that comes up in some political contexts and not others. And it turns out that when it tends to come up when basic income has been studied in Namibia, when it's been studied in Kenya, in India, this is a big issue. And when it's studied here, not so much in the United States, even in areas that are dominated by people of color. It's something that seems to me that comes up when we're talking about indigenous people. It seems to me that it comes from a prejudice against indigenous people that they are more prone to alcoholism or drug abuse than other people, which really isn't true. Studies have shown that rich people and poor people are just about as prone to alcoholism and drug abuse as anyone else. And we know now one of the primary causes of drug and alcohol abuse is stress and fear, unhappiness, and depression, and that often stems from hopelessness. Among soldiers in Vietnam, when the United States was involved in that war, there was heavy drug use while people were in Vietnam, and very highly addictive drugs. And most of those people, when they got back, stopped using. Those who kept using were the ones that had the most stressful, difficult, hopeless lives. To a great extent, drug addiction and alcohol addiction are side effects of hopelessness and depression. And one of the major causes of hopelessness and depression is the stress that comes from a society where the default position, if you don't have a job and aren't eligible for government programs, that you will be homeless or you'll be in destitution. You relieve that stress, and very often alcoholism and drug addiction goes down. In the studies where this has been found, they have been found, no studies of basic income have found an increase in drug and alcohol use associated with the basic income. Not in Namibia, not in Kenya, not in India, not in the many studies that have happened in the United States. And I would expect over time, if you're building a more hopeful society, it would actually go down. That's not coming directly from studies of basic income, but it is coming from studies of addiction, including studies on animals that put animals in stressful environments, and they're more likely to become addicted to drugs. So a lot of our greatest fears simply aren't true. Now, another fear that people have is that people won't work. I think we tend to look at that on a one-sided level, because when you're trying to get somebody to do a job, when we've got an employer and an employee, the working conditions and the wages are supposed to be negotiated, and it's supposed to be a free market. But yet, when we have a lot of people under stress, well, I need to get a job to keep myself alive, and the government programs aren't very friendly to people who are refusing jobs, that gives an incentive for employers to pay low wages and to give bad working conditions. We actually need disadvantaged, less privileged people to have the power to say no to bad jobs in order to give employers the incentive to create good jobs, to pay good living wages, and to share the benefits of profits and economic growth with their employees. We've had a problem with stagnant wages throughout the United States and Canada for the last 40 or 50 years. As our social safety nets have gotten weaker, we have reduced the incentive for employers to share the benefits of the enormous profits that they've made in the last 40 or 50 years with not just people at the low end of wages, but people throughout the wage spectrum. We need to look at that side of the equation and not just simply judge people as bad to say, well, I got offered this minimum wage job and it was a crap job, so I didn't take it. And just instead of judging them as a bad person, why are our minimum wage jobs such bad jobs in so many cases? We need to give individual power to the people. Basic income can help to do that in a way that can improve our health, our mental health, our educational performance. It is something that is good for society all around. The Northwest Territories, I think, is a particularly good place to start because it is small and it's remote, and it's one that where it's hard to make that argument that people don't want to work when there's a problem with getting jobs up here. You get money into the hands of people in remote locations. You also give an incentive for businesses to sell things in those areas. That creates jobs and opportunities. You want jobs and opportunities to come to the remote locations in the Northwest Territories. A basic income is an excellent way to do that, rather than having policies which essentially give people a big incentive to leave the lands that they've been living in for years and years. You can reverse that incentive, or at least reduce that incentive through something like a basic income guarantee. And it's also with a small population. The population here is about 45,000 people. That is going to be kind of like a large pilot project to have the 45,000 people in the Northwest Territories eligible for a basic income or a basic income guarantee, eligible for that would be a chance to find out, and I believe show the world how this policy can really work to help people as a whole. Now, I should say that there are two models of this. There are two models of a basic income guarantee floating around. I am most sympathetic with the idea of a basic income guarantee is just making sure that there's a floor under everybody's income, so that no one falls below a certain amount, preferably amount not hard enough to keep them out of poverty. But I would take any amount to start out with is better than nothing. But these two models are, one way to do that is to give an unconditional income to people, whether they make, no matter, regardless of what their other condition is. That one is usually called a universal basic income, and that's what my research focuses on. However, the guaranteed annual income is another form of basic income guarantee, which gives it only to those whose income is otherwise low. The advantage of that one is it avoids both giving people and taxing people at the same time. The disadvantage is, in order to make that one work, the government has to know at any given moment how much you're making. With the universal basic income everyone has that dividend coming in all the time, and the balance is made up on the tax side. And the government can figure out your taxes at it doesn't need to know what you make any given week to make sure you're getting the right amount with that model. And I think that is really better for the recipients. However, in Canada, the discussion has very much moved to the guaranteed annual income. Sometimes they're calling that now the guaranteed basic income. It's moved in that direction because it's considered to be administratively easier for the legislatures that are talking about the idea. On the balance sheets, the way we calculate them, it comes off sounding like it's cheaper, even though the net cost of both of them is the same. Either of those, I think, would be a powerful step in the right direction. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So I just want to ask the member if they have any questions. Okay, Ms. Reed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for your presentation. Greatly appreciated. About halfway through, you were speaking a little bit around how a basic income can incentivize employers to provide better wages. Could you speak a little bit more to that, sir?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Mr. Widerquist.
Okay, thanks. Yes, it is for really the very reason that people will criticize a basic income. We say, well, if we have a basic income, some people might not work. Well, they might not work at the going wage. But the question usually ends there. People might not work as many hours at the going wage as they do now. But that's not the end of the story. In the experiments that have been done on basic income, going back to 1968 in the United States and going back to, I think it's 1974, 75 when they began in Canada, they've been going on and off ever since. There was no cases have they found people who, oh, I'm eligible for a basic income guarantee, I'm not going to do anything productive. There are no cases where people do that. There are cases where primary caretakers leave the labor force in order to spend more time with their children. Well, that's a very important form of work. It might be more important than working at McDonald's or A&W, or a lot of things that are done in the paid labor market. But also, it's also very often caretakers will have two jobs and they'll quit one of them, or they'll scale back on one of them and they're not leaving the paid labor force. So that is so, and there are many other, and of course, caring for children is one of the most acute and recognizable forms of non-market labor. But there are many others: caring for the elderly, caring for the disabled. A lot of that is unpaid or underpaid. People doing more of that rather than working at low-level, unskilled jobs is very often a good thing. And it is promotion of work in the true sense. It might not be promotion of employment or money-making, but it's a promotion of work in a very true sense. Another thing that people, if you look at what people would do with their time, very often people will spend the time, if they do reduce their hours, they will spend that time in training to get a better job. It is not necessarily good that less privileged people spend all of their days working 40 or more hours a week at low-level jobs that gives them very little time to move up and very little opportunities to move up in the world. It is very often better for them to take time out of the labor force to train, to do education, as the children of more privileged backgrounds are often expected to do. Nobody thought I was a bad person because I didn't get a job at 18. I went to university for 4 years, which I wouldn't have been able to afford if I hadn't got scholarships and my parents hadn't been relatively privileged. Nobody thought it was bad that I left the labor force again to get a doctorate. And I did it twice, to do graduate school twice. Nobody thought that was a bad thing, but not everyone has that opportunity. It is good that people have that opportunity, and they often come out as better, more productive workers when they do it. Another way that it happens, but one thing that we found, this was especially true in the 1970s experiments. One of the fascinating things that they found was that they did find that the control group, the ones that weren't getting the basic income guarantee, worked on average more hours than the experimental group, the ones getting the basic income guarantee. They did work more hours. However, they also found that whether they were in the control of the experimental group was not the main reason. Is not the main determinant of how much they worked. The main determinant of how much they worked was the health of the macroeconomy, how many good jobs are available. When more jobs were available, both groups worked more. When fewer jobs were available, both groups worked less. The difference was, when people became unemployed, people in the control group, that is the people getting the basic income, the people not getting the basic income, those people tended to take the first job that they could find. Whereas people who were in the experimental group, the ones getting the basic income guarantee, tended to take their time to find the right job, to find a better job. That is good for those people, and that's something that should be encouraged, finding a job that is a good fit. But also, when you do that, when this is not just an experiment, and this is something that's about all the experiments could show, because they were randomly selected experiments, the random control experiments. They could not show how does an employer respond to that. How does an employer respond when people who become unemployed are taking more time to find a good job? That gives employers an incentive from basic economic theory and many other studies of other aspects of the economy. That gives the employers incentive. If I need to make this a better job in order to attract workers, I've got to give better working conditions. I've got to give better wages. I've got to give better advancement potential. It gives employers an incentive then to share the benefits with everyone. And what we've never been able to study, because you can only find this out if the whole territory has it, is what is the impact when everyone in the territory has access to a basic income guarantee? And that incentive is passed on to employers where they have to make jobs better. That's something that we would find out if a large territory like the Northwest Territories was to introduce a basic income guarantee.
Okay. MLA to start.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Dr. Widerquist. I am a big believer in UBI, and in particular how we can make it work in areas like the Northwest Territories, where we have a relatively small population and a high need for more economic mobility, especially in small communities that are largely isolated from market economies. That being said, I think we taking the entire territory on this trajectory seems like too large in the imagination for our policymakers here. Where we have had success in Canada is through smaller targeted pilot projects, and given that some of the communities that would benefit most of this are very small, do you think that would still be an effective case model if we did a pilot project in, a rural and remote community of 500 people in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Widerquist?
Well, I am a university professor, so I'm used to somebody asks a question, it's my job to answer immediately. So yes, I don't know of a basic income being piloted in a really remote community as of yet. There's been lots of different kinds of pilots. So we've piloted them in small towns in Namibia, in big cities in India, in rural Kenya, and we've in every conceivable sort of neighborhood in the United States, even targeted at people at things like people leaving the penal system. We've targeted at people leaving foster care, and so. But I don't know of one targeting a remote community. And there is one thing that you learn from targeting a remote community that you don't learn by targeting even a saturation study of a less remote community, is you learn a little bit more about the effects on business in the community as a whole. Because the more isolated it is, the bigger those effects on business as a whole. How much of incentive is that when people in this little community have more money? What kind of incentive is that for businesses to try to sell things there? And what kind of an incentive is that for businesses, once they're doing that, to pay better wages there? Those are two very interesting things that we learned. However, we've done a lot of pilots, and I also think we need to think beyond the pilot. If the Northwest, of course, I've been studying this since the 20th century, and so I would be in favor of moving towards a full basic income right now. If you don't find that feasible, I would compare the Northwest Territories, which I'm less familiar with, to places that I'm more familiar with, where big international corporations aided by the governments of the world, have come in and extracted a lot of resources. Places like Alaska, places like Norway, and places like the Persian Gulf, or in Qatar, where I work, or as my Qatari acquaintances would prefer if I called it the Arabian Gulf. We know it as the Persian Gulf. But in all of those areas, big international corporations have come in and extracted a lot of resources. And in those three areas, Norway, Alaska, and Qatar, they've done things that a lot of places have failed to do. They've made sure that every single citizen has benefited from that resource extraction. Maybe they haven't done good enough to prevent global warming. Well, they certainly haven't, but they have done things that at least they're getting money for that. Now, but there are a lot of other countries that have failed in that. Nigeria, Venezuela, Mexico. Go to a shanty town in any of those countries and ask, how have you benefited from the oil sales? A tremendous amount of money in oil sales that your country has given to the international corporations of the world. And you will find these people saying, well, gee, I don't know, I can't think of anything. But in Alaska, Norway, and Qatar, people, well, yes, of course I've benefited. They've benefited because some of those sales have been dedicated to people. Alaska has a very small dividend, which you're probably familiar with. They've taken a small amount of the oil revenue that they've made, they put that in a fund, and then people in Alaska get a dividend off the interest in that fund. So they're actually getting a tiny slice. In Norway is capturing much more of the international revenue that resource extraction companies have made. And they've used that for all kinds of public services, including a state pension that every single Norwegian is getting. So every Norwegian knows that they benefit from that. What I would most like to see, beyond a pilot, would be moving towards some sort of a resource use tax going to a dividend of even a very small size. Of course, I'd like one that's large enough to live on, but one that gets more money into the less privileged people of the Northwest Territories is a small step in the right direction. And the models of Alaska and Norway provide a great way to move in that direction.
Mr. Tester, you have a follow-up?
Yes. Yeah, actually, that was one of my campaign promises, to develop a resource dividend, and I don't think there's much interest from this group of MLAs, so I haven't really pushed it. And it's interesting, I spoke to a constituent who's from Scandinavia, and he thought it was a crazy idea to do a resource dividend because in Norway they manage things so differently with the sovereign wealth fund. But that being said, I think, while I'm supportive of the idea, I think there are nuances in the Northwest Territories that perhaps you're less familiar with. And I think the example you gave, like the tax and dividend model, I think it depends on low income earners having access to low emissions resources. Because right now in the Northwest Territories, for example, many people who are low income earners don't have the ability to produce less emissions. They don't have access to cheaper, so everyone's polluting the same, regardless of income. So I think that's flawed, at least in our context, that people with power in the system or wealth in the system are somehow using more. Everyone's kind of using the same level because we can't switch to different alternatives. And our pollution pricing impacts everyone equally because there are fewer alternatives. And typically to access lower polluting alternatives, you need wealth. And the government can only afford to create so many incentives to make those switches. So I think that's an issue. I think globally, perhaps you can have more of a theoretical argument, but how it works here in the North is very different than an academic exercise. Our income assistance system works very differently, and our resource development industry works very differently. And in many cases, they are benefiting indigenous communities and rural and remote communities without the need for government intervention. So are you aware of kind of the nuances of the Northwest Territories as you recommend these things to us? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Widerquist.
Yes, well, there's an excellent report. There's an excellent report that I have just read by Alternatives North about prospects for a basic income guarantee in the Northwest Territories. And one of the things that they talk about is the large number of people in the Northwest Territories who spend a significant amount of their time in traditional foraging activities, trapping, fishing, hunting, and getting a significant amount of their calories in their diet from these more traditional activities. If you are doing that, you are definitely consuming a lot less resources than somebody who's going to Copper House and drinking and eating Atlantic salmon that's been flown in from Nova Scotia. So I'm sure there is a higher level of resource use in the Northwest Territories than everywhere else, but there's going to be differences. There's going to be differences. There's going to be somebody who's above average for this region and people who are below average for this region. But also, I think one of the advantages that you probably have here, which is that a lot of your above average resources users in the Northwest Territories are not people, they're corporations. And they're corporations that are extracting those resources and using them elsewhere. Those are the people. The people who own those institutions are really the main targets of a resource use tax.
Yeah, we'll get back to you on the second round of questions. Mr. MLA Nerisu?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was intrigued to hear that, you build a hopeful society, the use of alcohol and drugs will decline. Then you said, you distribute the revenue equally amongst the microeconomy. In terms of building a hopeful society, I would assume that you're meaning that this be a continuous building on that society itself, be continuously, where everyone will benefit from the basic income. So in our region, we have a small population and we go through boom and bust economies. Like in the 80s, there was the oil and gas boom up in the Arctic, and that didn't last long. Everybody thought it was going to last long. Now we're coming to the end of the diamond industry. So, it's just like, can you build on more on building a hopeful society and spreading the and distributing the revenue equally?
Mr. Widerquist?
Yes. There's, of course, much more we need to do. We need to do, especially in indigenous communities, to build a more hopeful society. I hear land acknowledgements in Canada very often, but we need to go beyond the mere acknowledgement, and we need a negotiated settlement that's going to be something that indigenous communities can say yes to. Can say yes, this is something that I like. And I'm not an expert on this. I'm sure you have access to many people who are expert on this. That is one at the group end of creating a more hopeful society. We need an indigenous land settlements and an end to oppression. We also, when we need that for society, we need other things to give hope to society in general. But what basic income does is, a basic income, whether it is the model that I prefer, which is everybody gets the same amount, rich or poor, or if it's the graduated model where it's a basic income guarantee and and people get more the lower their income is. Whether it's those models, what that does is works on the individual end. We need something that's going to work on the group end, that's going to empower the communities. But we need something that is going to empower every individual member of that community. Money is power. And having this security, then I know I don't have to go to the first job I can get to keep security. And I don't have to do that. I don't have to worry about being thrown off the welfare rolls because I turned down a really bad job. That empowers individuals on the individual level. And that helps, that shores up, it doesn't mean that we don't need the stuff on the group end, but I think that we need both individual and group empowerment. And basic income, because money is power, is very important to bringing that empowerment down to the individual level.
Ms. MLA Nursu, do you have a follow-up?
What?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm surprised, you bringing up land claims. I'm part of a land claim group, and our land, I mean, it could be working better. It was since 1992, and it's a collective agreement between four communities, and we have some 32, over 3,000 beneficiaries that's in this claim. And the investments they make is not shared equally amongst the beneficiaries. It seems like the administrators of this claim are benefiting more than anybody else. And we've questioned this, and so once a year maybe we'll get a small dividend equal amongst everybody that's in this claim, but that doesn't that doesn't go nowhere. It just goes to alcohol for the majority of the beneficiaries, because we have a high unemployment rate within my region, and there's not much jobs to choose from. So whatever jobs is available, it's probably taken by anybody that wants it. So it's just I was just surprised to hear you bring up a land claims group, because there is I think there's 4 within the Northwest Territories, and in my region there's two groups that one is really productive. They've invested good, wisely, and they give dividends maybe once or twice a year, but it's the same thing. It's just high unemployment, and it'll be good if these land claim groups can help help the individuals within these communities benefit more, rather than having the administrators, only the people that work in these offices, benefit from this land claims group that was supposed to make life easier for the beneficiaries of this claim. It's more of a statement rather than a question. Thank you.
Mr. Ryderquist?
You're probably familiar with the casino dividends that a lot of U.S. tribes have gotten. There's some glitch in U.S. law that a lot of the gambling industry in the United States is owned by native tribes, and there's been a very wide range of how they've used the funds. Some of them have used it entirely for collective projects. Others have used almost all of it for dividends for members of the tribe. And And there are other sources of revenue, such as in Alaska, some of the native nations are receiving oil and other resource extraction money, and some of them are using that for individual dividends. It is difficult for me as an outsider to speak to how the First Nations should deal with the settlements that they are getting, the revenue that they are getting. That's for them to decide. I can say that there are people who are studying these casino dividends and other dividends, and that has been shown to be very beneficial to members of the group as a whole. And I can also say, you spoke before about you've had booms, you've had busts, and I can tell you I can tell you, as I'm sure you'll agree, there will be more booms in the future and there will be more busts. And one of the reasons that Alaska has done well with its dividend was because the governor at the time, Jay Hammond, foresaw that. And he wanted to make sure that the revenue that he knew was temporary would be a permanent beneficiary for the state and would benefit everyone in the state. And he bargained for that throughout his 8 years in office, 74 to 82. And it was very popular to create a sovereign wealth fund that was going to smooth out the income for that. But it was not as popular at the time to have a dividend shared by everyone. He pushed that through bargaining through the legislature to make sure not only would we have a dividend, not only would we have a sovereign wealth fund to make sure that we smooth out the boom and bust, but also that we will share out the revenue from that in a way that everyone as an individual will benefit and it won't all get hijacked by political insiders. That's why I think the sovereign wealth fund and dividend model is very good. In Norway, people don't think of it as a resource dividend because they don't call it that, but they do have a citizen's pension that goes to every citizen and that is funded out of these international oil sales. And they have one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world from their oil revenues. So they might not think of it as a resource dividend, but they certainly have one. It's targeted at the elderly, but everyone who lives long enough will get it. So in that sense, it is universal. These are good ways to smooth out the boom and bust and make sure we all benefit from it. And I think if you look back at the history of just about any boom and bust, you find most of the ordinary people don't benefit from the boom and they're harmed by the bust. That we need something to make sure that there's more universal benefit from that in the future. So I think this model is out there, and also you can learn from the mistakes of Alaska. Jay Hammond wanted all of Alaska's oil revenue to go to the fund. He wanted every cent of it, and the legislature wanted it to go to a tax cut. And he knew that a tax cut would benefit the wealthy the most and benefit low-income people the least. But he could not get them to agree to what he was doing without also eliminating Alaska's income tax. They eliminated the income tax in favor of a revenue that they knew was temporary. And because of that, Alaska is facing a fiscal crisis now. As oil revenues decline, they have less money coming in. They're faced with they've got to raise some other taxes. Had they not eliminated the income tax and put all of that money into a resource dividend, into a sovereign wealth fund with a dividend, Alaska would have a much larger sovereign wealth fund now, a much larger dividend, and a more solid fiscal system because they wouldn't have relied on resource taxes for general revenue. That would still be coming out of income taxes. So it is a very good way to deal with a boom and bust cycle that you get in an area that's largely dependent on resource extraction.
Thank you, MLA Yakalaya.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. It's so good to hear the hope that could be generated from activities or ways of being to change a society to become prosperous and to grow in a way that supports everyone. That's real. That is something real. The language, the attitude, the state of affairs that we find ourselves in, and I'm really thankful that Mr. Testart said that he had also looked at possibly doing this, but didn't think it was doable within this group. I think it's doable, and I think I campaigned on, it's now 2024. Why isn't everyone in the North, why don't all of us own our own houses? Why do we not own our own cabins, our own jet boats, our own skidoos, our own quads, so we could live the life that we were born into? The poverty thinking stemmed from, it goes back into history, from the boarding schools that they call them the residential schools. The stifling way of being, the fear-based teachings, all that stuff came from that. And so when you talk about this income, universal income, it's a new way of thinking, and it's pretty cool, actually. I think it's pretty cool because it opens the door to hope, and our people need that. We need to hear more of this. This needs to happen, and it's happening now. So I'm very grateful that you're here. You came to present this to us. I really appreciate that. It's a new way of thinking, a new way of being, and it can happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yakalaya. Mr. Waterquist?
Yeah, and as far as establishing that hope, I would say, my answer to that earlier question about Northwest Territories isn't ready for a full basic income yet, is establishing the precedent even at a low level is really important. And you can do that with there's so many opportunities to do that. Every time there's there's someone wants to do new resource extraction, a new mine of any kind, new forestry or new fishing rights or something like that, those companies are willing to make a deal. In Alaska, when those companies wanted to get to the North Slope, they were willing to pay for that. And you take that, even if it only gets you whatever this opportunity, it only gets you a very, very small dividend. Alaska started with $1,000 in its first year and went down to, I think, it was 1982 US dollars, and went down to, I think, $250 in the second year, something very small. But you establish the precedent, and you say, well, we established it for this one industry, then we can maybe establish it for another industry. And it's also, if you are worried, if you're worried about substance abuse, it doesn't have to be a resource dividend. It could be an alcohol dividend. We tax an alcohol or a cannabis dividend. People wanting to, you tax cannabis, and then you You tax cannabis and alcohol and anything else, maybe sugar use or something, anything you want to discourage, you tap that and you have your alcohol, cannabis, sugar dividend, and you tax those industries. And then if you're getting more in this dividend than you're paying in these taxes, that is your reward for being a low consumer of alcohol. And so there are a lot of opportunities to just start it at a small level and get that precedent going that this territory has something that's universal for everyone, no questions asked.
Malia, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, and to speak to, thank you for that. And to speak to George's, Mr. Nurse's comment about coming from a settlement area. My riding is an unsettlement area, so I represent part of a group that is unsettled, that the territory is not, the region is not settled, so I can't speak to that. The leadership will make those decisions. Like you said, it's up to the leadership to make the decisions, to choose however they choose to live and however they choose to support or gain prosperity for the people in the region, or not. You know, it's up to them how they do that. And so I see the difference in coming from a settlement area where you have a choice. You can choose. You can choose. You can make your way. You can dream big and follow that and go for it. But if you're in an unsettled area, you can dream, but you have to wait till everybody gets in line to make sure that everything is, all the boxes are checked off and all that, you know. And so to get to the settlement area, to get to a settlement place where you decide to settle. So there's the have and the have-nots, you know, so that's what I'm seeing. And so I'm very hopeful today, thankful and hopeful, because what I talked about earlier in my campaign about, and I talked to many different people about that, was there's a way for us to do this. And I think somebody said it right when they described it and said, if your attitude is right, the facts don't count. In some ways, because the facts are somebody else's opinion.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Mr. Widerquist?
Thank you. Yeah, and I should say, in any power structure, whether it's local, community, or it's community-based, or it's regional or national, any power structure can be hijacked by elite structures, and so it's up to the people, and we need systems that the power remains in the people, and the representatives, however they're selected, are answerable to the people at all times, to make decisions that are really good for the people who are farthest from the centers of power, the least privileged.
Thank you, Mr. Widerquist. Ms. MLA Hawkins?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your perspective. I mean, I don't, I'll just say frankly, I'm not sure I share all of it. I'm not saying I'm not sympathetic to some of the concerns. I mean, it would be wrong to say I don't care about them. If anyone said that, I'd say that's a bold-faced misunderstanding. I am more worried about the operation and mechanisms on how things work, and certainly the rollout of stuff. So I would have some deep concerns, but I mean, as someone who likes, maybe more self-described than publicly described by others, but I really believe I try to be an egalitarian in a way that says, hey, I believe in fairness for all. But I also believe in the advantage of those who take risk and those who are willing, to put it all on the line. So problem is ideologies have a way of suppressing those who risk everything. I mean, so, I was appreciative of the fact of your honesty about that you haven't heard of a basic income in a small remote area. I mean, I'm very curious on the impacts of how that would have, or what that would change. I mean, when we put a road in a small rural remote community, we change the full dynamics. I'm referring to access. It means drugs come in differently as opposed to just on the plane. It means maybe groceries might be cheaper with the road, maybe they're not. People are leaving town, which means you change the social exchange and dynamics. In other words, less kids in school, things, so any little change can have an amazing ripple effect, and that's the ripple effect I'm talking about. Is sometimes it's very difficult. Just to wrap up, Madam Chair, to get to my question here. I am familiar with the Alaska Fund. We've talked about it in previous assemblies I've served before, and the dynamics of it and the to's and fro's, and I 100% agree with you that giving it away to tax breaks does nothing for the public. When we looked at setting up our Heritage Fund, I remember being part of that discussion and exchange, seeing it as a broader picture of its. At the time, I viewed it as, and times have changed, and I've been on a sabbatical for a while from politics. But that said, I always viewed it as a stabilization funds for public shock, and what I mean by that is taxation that you're sucked, but the Heritage Fund is there to buttress so that way we're not forcing people to make choices we don't want them to make. In other words, so there's a lengthy explanation on that, but I'm sure you get it. As far as Indigenous settlement goes, yeah, we have land claims here. Many are in different stages of it. Some are implementation are still in the throes of discussion, and certainly even within that. But ultimately, circling back to the Heritage Fund, one of the problems of it growing so slow is the economy. Two of the problems is we share it, which is good. We share it with the Indigenous governments. That was one of the agreements to get sort of cohesion around the philosophy of doing it this way. But the other thing is the suppression of investment, because we are a resource territory. And I don't know why we wear that like shame, because we need a GDP. And in order to speak to what you're saying is we need a GDP. And so, ideologically, people will oppose the development of resource roads and mines and whatnot, but it's the same taxation that they want and expect to pay for this basic income. So, I mean, it's a real struggle, like it's a Gordian knot. Like, how do we get through these things? I don't want holes, but I want free milk. I know it's not that simple, but it's like that kind of dynamics. So I guess to the question, Madam Chair, now that I've sort of framed sort of the thing, like how do you get past the sale point? Because this is the one I would face. If I went to every door today, I guarantee, sure, there'll be a few people in favor, there'll be a few people super excited for it, but ultimately there will always be those very skeptic in the sense of, and those will ask me probably questions about is, how do you get past the challenge of someone saying, I'm working just so someone doesn't have to work? And the other question, just to save time, Madam Chair, because I know all of us have to get ready for session, is how do you explain it to those in the employment, the venture economy? In other words, those are spending money, risking money, gaining money. How do you balance the risk about shared benefits? Because no one shares in the risk. But, there's an expectation there's a share in the benefits. And to me, if there's a way of equalizing that, that makes perfect sense. So the two questions are really about, again, just in summary, just to clear is, how do you get past the people who say, why am I working for those who don't want to work? And how do you balance the argument of shared risk versus benefit? It's a tough one. Thank you.
Mr. Ryderquist?
There seem to be like two aspects of your question. One about making it work when you have all these other competing interests, competing things, and of course, infrastructure is very important. But what I think you want to do is one thing that I think everybody has to agree about Norway is Norway works. I mean, there's a very functional society. Things work in Norway. It's not Valhalla, but things work very well in Norway. And I more often, in the studies of this, I more often talk about Alaska because they are doing the dividend model. And Norway, even though all citizens benefit, It's not a straight-out dividend. So I focused more on Alaska, but there is, what we really need is a combination of the two models, because Norway is doing one thing that Alaska isn't. And that is they're driving a hard bargain with these international companies that are coming in there to get the oil. Do you realize over the last 40 or 50 years, the state of Alaska has retrieved about 30% of the oil revenue that's come to Alaska. The other 70% has gone to the international oil companies. In Norway, those numbers are reversed. The Norwegian government has extracted 70% of the revenue, whereas the international companies have only gotten 30%. And they still find those companies want to come in there and drill that oil. They've driven a hard bargain and they made it work for them. People, when and so they've been able to use that for direct cash benefits to their elderly citizens, as well as better schools, better infrastructure. They've really made it work. I don't want to speak to about Qatar, because although they have also driven hard bargains and gotten a lot of money, they've also had other problematic elements that I don't want to get into. Now, then the other aspect of your question was about why do I work when someone else doesn't have to? So someone else doesn't have to. That, I think, is something that people very often say, but it is not something that I think really reflects what is going on with a basic income. What we should be doing with our tax system is moving it towards taxing privilege. If you're using more resources than other people, you have a privilege. If you are polluting the world more than other people, you are taking a privilege. If you have better access to education, you have privilege, and so on. We're taxing privilege, and a well-structured basic income guarantee will benefit not just people who don't work at all, and there are very few of these people, but it will benefit 40 to 70% of people will be net beneficiaries of a basic income. So when you're talking about supposedly a non-worker exploiting a worker, it's only the workers in the top 30% and the ones that are paying more in taxes than they're getting from this. And most of those are going to be people in the top 10 or 5 or 1%. Those are the ones who are paying the most. And those are the most privileged. They're not simply in the high incomes because they work so hard. They're in the high incomes because they have privilege. And a lot of the workers who work the hardest and have the least privileges will be net beneficiaries from the basic income program. Thank you.
Thank you. We're pressed for time. I still have Shauna Morgan, MLA Morgan. She's on the social committee. So I will go to Shauna, and then if we have more time, we'll go back to Mr. Hawkins. Thank you. Shauna Morgan, MLA Morgan.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I made a statement yesterday in the House about guaranteed basic income, and one of the things that I brought up was, so on the one hand, we want everyone to have a sense of security and that sense that they know where the income's going to be coming from. But on the other hand, people are really concerned about people becoming or feeling dependent on government. That's a real concern in I think, all the communities in this territory. That's unhealthy for people. It doesn't, motivate people to, either, go for retraining or more education or try to find work or create work for themselves. In any case, so there's this difficult balance between wanting to create security but avoiding dependence. Do you have thoughts on how from other jurisdictions, we can walk that tightrope and avoid creating that sense of dependence on government funds?
Mr. Widerquist?
Yes, and that is actually one of the key benefits of basic income, is that basic income, an income given to everyone, is not what economists call a work disincentive, because it makes it so you have higher income in total, but you don't get more because you don't work. In fact, you get more if you work. It's a certain small income for everyone, and more given to those who do some work that the society recognizes as useful. The existing system does not have that feature. The existing system is you have to get eligible for this program, whether it's public housing, or whether it is disability, or whether it is unemployment insurance. And very often, if your income goes up or you take a job, you lose various aspects of this, and you end up very often in this case of of being only marginally better off if you take a job. Or even sometimes, in some cases, you actually end up being worse off if you take a job. With a basic income program, you are always better off earning more money. You're always financially better off earning more money. The conditional programs can't guarantee that. A basic income system can. So it is only this, I think, prejudice against low-income people we have, that all they want to do is just quit their jobs and live really poor off of what they can get, which is not realistic of how people live. What they do is they respond to the incentives that are given, as we all do. Yes, it makes it possible for people to live without working, but it also gives them incentive to earn more, both incentives to do something that gives meaning to their life, but also to do something that is going to give them a higher income. And basic income is structured better than our existing programs for doing that.
Ms. Morgan, you have a follow-up? Okay. Yes, I do have a question too as well. Since I know, thank you for the presentation. This is a really well-informed presentation, and I know our leaders are probably listening. What I heard from you, the word that you use, I like it, shantytown, privilege, cooperation, resource extraction, build hopeful society. And yesterday we did a presentation, or we did a member statement on income support, and giving hope for our youth, and especially the future generations. We talked about the dependency, and just like Ms. Morgan talked about the basic income, and MLA Reid, and all of us in here, we did talk about that. So which is good, and how can we get them off the, income support or some form of assistance, so to get them back to become a tax-paying society, because we know that society runs based on tax, and this is a tax community. We do have a tax-based community in the NWT. So I just, and then I'm sure you heard it so many times. You're a professor and you work in in the States, and you heard from the American Indians, and so we know that since colonizations, we're trying to find balance since colonizations between the privileged and underprivileged. And here in the Northwest Territories, I don't want to apologize, but I just want to be cautious here. Not really, I don't know if I should be cautious, but anyways, here in the Northwest Territories, there is privilege and underprivilege that we can never find, will never be equal, okay? Because there's a P1. P1 is like us, the indigenous that were born and raised here. And there's a P2. So a lot of people have said that at the expense of the indigenous people, P2 are advancing, over the indigenous with all the program and services that's available for the indigenous and others are using it. So how can we find balance? How can we find balance within our society, especially in the north, where you can see it? I'm sure you've been, how long you've been here? Yeah, in the north. Well, anyways, I'm sure wherever you went, you saw it, you felt it. The underprivileged are the indigenous. And you saw them everywhere. Wherever you went, you saw the dreadful, there's no hope. So we're trying to change that here, and I really do thank my colleagues here, for doing the theme day yesterday, identifying what can we do to help, our indigenous. And I'm very grateful that they've done that yesterday. And it is the truth, it is the truth in the Northwest Territories. We are at disadvantage. But I just want to know, how can we find balance because you're talking about the basic income and the guaranteed basic income. How can we find balance in NWT so that we can exist? I know they'll never be equal. We'll never be equal, but how can we find a balance so that our people can go up or to get off the system? And it's, I know I probably upset some people here by saying that, but this is the truth, and I cannot shy away from the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's a constant and there's a constant and I think entirely misdirected belief among white people that groups that want redress of grievances, whether it's indigenous people, descendants of slaves, or other disadvantaged groups, that what they want is privilege over white people, which is ridiculous. They want a redress of grievance. I don't believe any disadvantaged group is looking to become a privileged group. They're looking for equality. And what I believe is that the direction that needs to be moved is a two-pronged approach. It is both group-based and individual-based. And on the individual level, as I said before, money is power. And what we need is for less privileged individuals and less privileged groups to have more power, not just on the group level and not just on the individual level, but on both levels. And money is an important tool to doing that because of the nature of our society. If we had a different sort of society, land or land access would be just as powerful. But in the society we have today, money has to be a part of it. Now, a basic income guarantee, if it's given to every legal resident of Northwest Territories, is not reparations. But it does some of the things that we want reparations to do. Because it empowers less privileged people, and people from less privileged groups are more likely to be less privileged individuals. So it does some of the things that you want reparations to do. It moves in that direction. And just the role of this is it's not charity. It is not alms for the poor. It is empowerment for the disadvantaged.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the answer, because I was looking for that word, empowerment. That's what we are looking for. And in Canada, and I'm sure it's the same in the U.S. too, in Canada, we have high rates of Indigenous people that are incarcerated, and those are the underprivileged. And same in the USA, where high rates of the colored people, the black people are incarcerated. So, so those are the underprivileged. So that's why I'm, like the word that you use, the empowerment, like it's gonna help. And that's what we're trying to do here too, through our member statement, by working together, by trying to find, a balance that how we can, coexist, as stated in our treaty agreement, because I come from a settled area in Clicho. So we are trying our best, within our society to find a balance and to do more for our people. But we're making progress, but, like, we're getting, but we do need, well, it's taking its time, but it's not my call, it's I do support what the government is doing. So we're getting along. I think we're making some progress. It's not going fast, but it's getting there. So I just want to say thank you to you, but I think MLA Yakalaya has a follow-up, and then with that after. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for your comments back. And also, just to know that when you talk about empowerment, and education will empower people, knowledge will empower people, new knowledge. And so Shauna talked about literacy in schools, literacy levels in our schools, and we also have to include financial literacy, because that will empower people to make good choices and help with making good choices. So, and then you said something about money is power. Power creates opportunity too. So having that type of knowledge and that way of thinking will create opportunity for residents in Northwest Territories, and it's a good way to look at it. So I want to thank you for your presentation, for coming. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So in here, Mr. Widerquist, thank you very much for joining us today, talking to us about the basic income, and it's well informed, and I think we have a good understanding of it, and I'm sure our leaders are listening to as well. And so with that, this concludes the public briefing. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all. It's been really an honor to have this discussion with you all here today.